She boarded the plane with nothing more than a carry-on and the hope of finally getting some rest after a week that had left her drained to the bone. To her, this flight was supposed to be nothing more than a quiet journey through the clouds, a place to shut her eyes and escape the noise of the world below. But the world has a way of reminding people like her that peace can be snatched away in an instant. At first, everything seemed ordinary. The hum of engines, the shuffle of passengers settling into their seats, the hollow announcements from the flight crew, all the familiar rituals of travel. She leaned back, closing her eyes, letting the comfort of routine wrap around her. But as the cabin darkened and the plane climbed higher, whispers began to ripple through the rows. Something was happening, something she could not see but could feel in the shifting energy around her. Then, a voice. The captain's voice, breaking through the calm. It carried none of the steady assurance passengers expect, but instead, a sharp edge of urgency. His words froze her heart and left the entire cabin in stunned silence. He wasn't asking about turbulence or a medical emergency. He was asking a question no one expected to hear thousands of feet in the air. Her pulse quickened, though she hadn't even moved. Why her? Why now? The unspoken truth was already tightening in her chest. People like her never blended into emergencies. No matter how calm, how quiet, how ordinary her life was, the moment something went wrong, eyes would find her. And they did. Dozens of strangers turned, their gazes heavy, suspicious, searching. It didn't matter that she was just another tired traveler who had paid for a seat like everyone else. To them, her presence suddenly felt like a variable, a risk, a problem that needed solving. That's how racism worked. It didn't announce itself with slurs or shouts, not always. Sometimes it was silent, a shadow that spread through fear, twisting perception until innocence became guilt without a word spoken. The air grew colder. Every second stretched thin with anticipation, each beat of her heart sounding louder in her ears. She wasn't the one with authority. She wasn't the one speaking over the intercom. She wasn't the one asking questions that carried the weight of danger. And yet, somehow, she was the one everyone stared at. What had the captain seen? What had convinced him to make such a terrifying announcement? And why did it feel like her life, her dignity, her very identity, was about to be put on trial in front of hundreds of strangers? One moment, she had been invisible, a weary passenger among many. The next, she was the center of suspicion, her skin color transforming her from traveler to target in the blink of an eye. And as the silence thickened and the captain's question echoed in her mind, one truth became unavoidable: this flight would not end the way she expected. But the question that would define everything still hung in the air: what happens when the fight against prejudice takes off at 30,000 feet? She wasn't a celebrity, a politician, or anyone who might expect their name to one day sit in headlines. She was simply a hard-working woman from Atlanta, carrying the weight of responsibilities that never seemed to ease. Her name was Maya, and her life, though quiet on the surface, was built on resilience forged through years of being underestimated. Maya was the kind of person who gave more than she had. She worked long hours as a nurse, tending to patients who often looked through her rather than at her. She had mastered the art of swallowing dismissive comments, enduring the subtle racism that crept into daily life like background noise, rarely loud enough to draw public outrage, but sharp enough to cut. She wasn't new to prejudice, she had simply learned how to keep moving despite it. Still, exhaustion had a way of breaking down even the strongest. That week had tested her limits. Double shifts at the hospital, late nights reviewing her younger brother's college applications, and endless worry about her mother's health had left her drained. The flight she had booked wasn't a luxury, but a necessity, a chance to attend a small medical conference where she hoped to gain knowledge, and maybe, connections, that could open new doors for her career. When Maya arrived at the airport, there was nothing remarkable about her appearance. A modest blazer, sensible shoes, hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was the picture of a professional woman balancing responsibility with quiet ambition. Yet, in a world where appearances were never neutral for someone like her, she carried an invisible burden: the awareness that she could never truly blend in. Airports always reminded her of that truth. Security lines where her bags were searched more thoroughly than others. Random checks that never seemed so random. Glances from fellow travelers that flickered with suspicion before quickly hardening into indifference. It was an exhausting ritual, one she endured silently, because to protest would be to confirm their worst assumptions. That morning, she moved through the terminal like anyone else, clutching her boarding pass, weaving past hurried travelers. But beneath her calm exterior, she carried the quiet prayer of every black traveler: please, let this flight be uneventful. Please, let me just be a passenger, nothing more. Maya found her seat by the window, tucked her bag beneath the chair, and exhaled. For once, the world outside couldn't demand anything from her. She had no patience to comfort, no family to worry over in that moment. Just sky, clouds, and the temporary peace of being unreachable. But peace is fragile, and for Maya, it never lasted long. She closed her eyes, trying to let go of the week behind her. Yet her thoughts refused to quiet. She remembered her last shift at the hospital, the elderly patient who refused to be touched by her, whispering to another nurse, "I'd rather wait." She remembered the grocery clerk who had demanded to see her ID while the customer ahead walked through without question. She remembered the ache in her chest each time she smiled and pretended not to notice. Those memories weren't accidents. They were patterns. They were the reminder that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how respectable she made herself, she lived in a world that judged her before she ever spoke. Still, she kept her head high. She always had. Because if she let herself dwell on the injustice, she might collapse beneath it. And Maya couldn't afford collapse. Her family needed her steady, strong, moving forward. As the engines roared and the plane began to climb, she let herself drift, finally allowing her eyelids to grow heavy. Sleep was the one place where the constant vigilance of being a black woman in America could fade, where she could exist without having to prove her worth. But even in the sanctuary of sleep, tension stalked her. It wasn't loud, not yet. It was in the subtle way the man across the aisle shifted, eyeing her with a curiosity that wasn't friendly. It was in the hushed whispers of two passengers behind her, their tone sharp though their words were too low to catch. It was in the invisible weight of scrutiny, pressing against her without reason. She didn't notice it fully yet, but the audience could. The silence before the storm was settling into place. Because while Maya slept, high above the clouds, something began to stir in the cockpit. A decision, an announcement, an unfolding event that would soon pull her from the anonymity she longed for. And once it began, there would be no going back. For Maya, this flight was supposed to be a reprieve, a chance to exhale after too many days of carrying the world on her shoulders. But at 30,000 feet, she was about to learn a devastating truth. Even when you do everything right, even when you play by every rule, racism finds a way to hunt you down. And the moment it did, it wouldn't just threaten her peace, it would threaten her dignity, her safety, and perhaps even her future. The steady rhythm of the engines filled the cabin as Maya slept, her head leaning lightly against the cool window pane. To the casual eye, she was just another passenger finding a moment of rest on a long flight. But while she drifted in search of peace, the atmosphere around her was shifting, quietly at first, then steadily tightening like a noose. It began with a glance. A man in a pressed business suit across the aisle leaned toward his seatmate, whispering something, his eyes flicking toward Maya's row. A woman a few seats back lowered her voice mid-conversation, suddenly guarded, her gaze resting on the back of Maya's head for a beat too long. A ripple of unease spread through the cabin, subtle yet unmistakable. Passengers didn't speak loud enough for Maya to hear. They didn't need to. Suspicion doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers, traveling seat to seat until it takes on a life of its own. Then, over the intercom, the captain's voice cracked through the quiet. Calm at first, but lined with an urgency that no one could mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words strained, "if there are any trained fighter pilots or military personnel on board, please make yourselves known to the crew." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Heads turned. Eyes darted. A jolt of fear electrified the cabin. And in the chaos of uncertainty, fear sought an anchor. Too often, it found one in the person least deserving. Maya stirred, half awake, sensing the shift before understanding it. She blinked, disoriented, catching the way strangers stared, their expressions darkened by something she couldn't yet name. Whispers tangled with the captain's call, forming a storm of unease. She rubbed her eyes, confused. Why were so many people looking at her? A flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, her voice low, reassuring passengers with tight smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. But when she reached Maya's row, the smile faltered. She said softly, leaning close, "Can I ask where you're headed today?" The question was innocent on its surface. But Maya felt the undertow immediately. No one else was being asked. She hesitated, then answered quietly, "I'm attending a medical conference." The attendant nodded, but her eyes lingered, as though measuring Maya's words against some invisible suspicion. "If you need anything, please let me know," she added, before moving on. Yet her tone carried an unspoken weight. "We're watching you." Maya's chest tightened. She glanced around, realizing the scope of the scrutiny. Some passengers avoided her gaze altogether, pretending not to stare while clutching their armrests with white knuckles. Others didn't bother hiding it. Their fear was written plainly, as though the captain's announcement had confirmed every bias they carried. She tried to steady her breath, telling herself this was nothing more than paranoia, exhaustion mixing with imagination. But then came the second blow. A child, no older than 8, tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at Maya. The mother's response was a hurried whisper, her hand pulling the boy close, shielding him as though from danger. Maya's heart sank. That single gesture, so small, felt like a verdict. She thought of the countless times she had been judged in silence, on sidewalks, in stores, even in hospital halls where she worked tirelessly to heal people who sometimes recoiled at her touch. But this was different. This was magnified, amplified by fear at 30,000 feet where escape was impossible. The tension mounted with each passing minute. The captain's words repeated in passengers' minds, fighter pilot. On board. It suggested danger, sabotage, a threat hidden among them. And without evidence, suspicion settled on Maya. Suddenly, a man in the row ahead stood, craning his neck to get a better look at her. His voice, loud enough for others to hear, carried a cutting edge. "Why is she so calm?" he asked no one in particular. "Everyone else is on edge. Doesn't that seem strange?" The words sliced through the cabin like a blade. Murmurs rose. A few nodded, their unease hardening into quiet agreement. Calmness, once a virtue, had become an accusation. Maya froze. She wanted to defend herself, to demand why her presence alone had become suspect. But the weight of all those eyes pressed down on her. She knew the truth. In moments like these, protest was dangerous. Anything she said could be twisted, fed back into the loop of fear until it became proof of guilt. The flight attendants huddled near the galley, their hushed tones urgent. Maya caught fragments, "Keep watch, captain's concerned, passengers nervous." She wasn't meant to hear, but she did. Each word was another crack in the fragile shell of safety she had clung to. Her pulse raced. She tried to focus on the steady hum of the engines, to remind herself that she had done nothing wrong. But racism didn't care about truth. Racism fed on perception, on fear, on the readiness of strangers to believe the worst when looking at a face like hers. Minutes dragged, heavy and suffocating. Every sound, the click of a seatbelt, the shuffle of feet, felt amplified. Maya's body was still, but inside, her spirit trembled under the weight of judgment. Then, the announcement came again. This time sharper, more urgent. "If there are any trained military pilots on board, please notify a member of the crew immediately." A gasp spread through the cabin. Passengers sat rigid, their eyes darting once more. And then, as though a silent consensus had been reached, a dozen stares locked fully onto Maya. Her breath caught. She understood now. The whispering, the questions, the unease, it had all funneled toward this moment. Whether by coincidence or prejudice, she had become the answer to a question she had never asked. The captain's plea was about danger. But the passengers had already decided where that danger sat. Right beside the window, in seat 14A. The storm had begun. And Maya was at its eye. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, a relentless reminder of how high they were, how trapped she was. Maya's hands rested stiffly on her lap, fingers clenched together, but her stillness only deepened the suspicion brewing around her. Seat 14A had become the focal point of fear, and the pressure was unbearable. The man in front twisted in his seat again. "Why isn't anyone doing anything?" he demanded, his voice louder now, feeding the unease like gasoline on fire. Heads turned. A ripple of murmurs filled the cabin. "If the captain is worried about a threat, we can't just sit here." The word threat hung in the air like a verdict. It was unspoken, but everyone knew who he meant. A flight attendant approached, her smile stretched thin, her voice trembling with forced calm. Could you please stand and come with me?" Maya's heart pounded. She opened her mouth to ask why, but the words caught in her throat. She knew. She had always known. Her silence was not ignorance, it was survival. Arguing would only confirm what they already feared. She rose slowly, feeling the heat of countless eyes drilling into her. Her knees were weak, but she stood tall, forcing her spine to straighten even as dread tightened around her chest. Every step down the aisle was agony, her dignity unraveling under the gaze of strangers who saw not a woman, not a nurse, not a sister or daughter, but a danger. The attendant guided her toward the galley near the front of the plane. Whispered voices trailed behind. "I knew it," she looked suspicious. "Why didn't they check her bag more? This is why I hate flying." Each sentence sliced deeper, though none of them were said to her face. She wanted to scream that she was innocent, that she had done nothing but buy a ticket and board like everyone else. But the louder their whispers grew, the smaller her own voice felt inside. At the galley, another crew member waited, arms folded, expression tight. "We need to ask you some questions," he said, his tone clipped, as though courtesy was a luxury she hadn't earned. Her mouth was dry. "What is this about?" she managed, her voice shaking despite her effort to hold steady. "The captain received a report," the attendant said carefully. "Some passengers are concerned about unusual behavior." "Unusual behavior?" Maya repeated, stunned. "I was asleep." But the words bounced back, powerless against the weight of prejudice. In the eyes of those watching, sleep had somehow become evidence of guilt. The questioning continued, "Where are you traveling to? Why are you on this flight? Do you have identification?" Each inquiry led with doubt, as though her very existence required justification. She pulled out her conference papers, her hospital ID, even her driver's license, hands trembling as she passed them over. Still, the crew scrutinized her as though searching for flaws that weren't there. And all the while, the stares continued from behind, passengers craning their necks, whispering theories, feeding on fear. The cabin had become a stage, and Maya the unwilling center of a trial without defense. Then came the breaking point. A passenger stood from the middle rows, voice booming with conviction. "I don't feel safe with her on this plane. We should land and get her off before it's too late." The words struck like lightning. Gasps, nods, the swell of voices rising in agreement. Fear had tipped into outrage, and outrage demanded action. Maya's chest heaved. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. It wasn't just humiliation now, it was terror. The thought that this collective panic could strip her not only of dignity but of safety. What if the crew listened? What if she was forced off, branded as a threat for no reason other than her skin? She tried to speak, her voice trembling but fierce. "I am not a danger to anyone. I'm a nurse. I save lives every day. I came here to learn, to grow, to do better for my family and my patients. And yet here I am, standing in front of you, being treated as though I am guilty of something I didn't do. All because I dared to exist on this flight." The plane fell into an uneasy silence. For a moment, her words seemed to pierce the storm. But then, from the back, another voice cut through, "That's what they all say before something happens." The silence shattered. Her plea had not shifted the tide, it had fueled it. The attendants exchanged glances, torn between duty and prejudice, between calm and chaos. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, steady but grim. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are aware of the situation and are taking necessary precautions." Necessary precautions. The phrase chilled her. She had become the situation. Her knees buckled slightly, the weight of fear pressing harder. She imagined being detained, dragged off in handcuffs at the next airport, her name plastered in headlines, her career shattered before the truth could even breathe. For Maya, the nightmare wasn't turbulence or mechanical failure, it was this. To be turned into a villain, to have her humanity erased, to face the crushing truth that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much good she gave to the world, the color of her skin could transform her into a suspect in an instant. The cabin seemed to close in around her, the aisle narrowing, the walls pressing tighter. Every sound, the beep of a call button, the hiss of the air vents, felt magnified. Her pulse thundered in her ears. And then, as the plane soared higher into the sky, Maya realized something that made her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just about fear. It wasn't just about safety. This was about power, about a crowd that had decided who she was without knowing her at all. About a society that armed suspicion with authority, and stripped innocence bare. The worst of the injustice wasn't just that she was being accused. It was that no matter what she said, no matter what proof she offered, her voice would never carry the same weight as their fear. Her fate now hung not on truth, but on perception. And perception was already against her. At 30,000 feet, in a cabin filled with strangers, Maya was forced to confront the darkest reality of all. Sometimes survival doesn't depend on what you've done, but on who the world decides you are. The air felt razor-thin as the silence stretched, her body trembling under the verdict of suspicion. And just when it seemed the pressure could grow no heavier, when her hope began to fray to its last thread, the captain's voice broke through again. But this time, his words were not meant to reassure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said slowly, each word laced with gravity, "we have made a decision regarding the passenger in question." The cabin froze. All eyes turned to her. Her heart stopped. And in that suspended moment, Maya knew, whatever came next would change everything. The captain's words hung heavy in the air, each syllable like a weight pressing down on Maya's chest. We have made a decision regarding the passenger in question. For a heartbeat, the plane was silent. Hundreds of breaths caught, hearts suspended in the balance. Every eye fixed on her, waiting for the next moment to either confirm their fear or release it. And in that silence, Maya's world felt as though it was collapsing inward, shrinking to the size of that narrow aisle where she stood under judgment. Then, the voice continued. We ask that all passengers remain calm. After reviewing the matter, we have determined there is no cause for alarm. Please return to your seats. The words should have been a relief. They should have lifted the weight crushing her lungs. But relief never came. Because even as the captain cleared her name, the damage had already been done. Maya walked back to her seat in a haze, each step echoing with the sting of humiliation. The whispers didn't stop. They shifted. Now, instead of suspicion, there was dismissal. Overreaction. Better safe than sorry. She should understand. Excuses piled atop the silence, each one meant to soften their fear, but all of them slicing deeper into her dignity. She sat down quietly, eyes fixed on the window, forcing herself not to crumble. But inside, she was unraveling. How do you recover from being branded a danger in front of strangers? How do you sit still when the simple act of existing turned you into a suspect? She thought of her patients, of the people she served every day with compassion. Would they have looked at her the same way if they had been on this flight? Would they have feared her too? The hours that followed passed in suffocating stillness. The plane hummed forward, but time crawled. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She didn't speak. She sat frozen, replaying the scene again and again, each loop cutting deeper. When the plane finally landed, Maya moved quickly, eager to disappear into the anonymity of the crowd. But anonymity was impossible now. As she walked off, she caught the sideways glances, the quiet murmurs. To the passengers, she would always be that woman, the one who made the captain nervous, the one who could have been a threat. That night, alone in her hotel room, Maya wept. Not because she was afraid, but because she was tired. Tired of being reduced to suspicion. Tired of carrying the weight of other people's fear. Tired of being reminded, over and over, that no matter how hard she worked, how much good she did, her skin could still erase her humanity in an instant. But as the tears dried, a quiet fire lit inside her. The incident hadn't broken her, it had revealed a truth she could no longer ignore. This wasn't just her story. It was the story of countless others who had been profiled, judged, and silenced by the same prejudice. Maya thought of her younger brother, about to enter college, stepping into a world where the same suspicion might follow him into classrooms, jobs, or traffic stops. She thought of her mother, who had carried these burdens before her, warning her gently but firmly, "You have to work twice as hard to be seen as equal." She thought of generations before them, who had endured far worse, yet still carved out paths of resilience. And she knew, her pain had to mean something. She began to write. First in her journal, then in letters, then in essays. She told her story to colleagues, to friends, to strangers who asked. And in every telling, she refused to soften the truth. She named the fear. She named the injustice. She named the way silence and suspicion can wound more deeply than any weapon. Her voice, once silenced by the weight of prejudice, became her resistance. The flight itself faded into memory for most of the passengers. They moved on, chalking it up to a tense moment in the sky. But for Maya, it became a turning point. A reminder that racism doesn't always come with slurs or violence. Sometimes, it comes as a question whispered over an intercom, or 100 eyes casting you as guilty without evidence. And that truth, the quiet, everyday violence of being seen as less, was one the world needed to confront. Because this wasn't just about Maya. This was about every person who has sat in a classroom, on a bus, in a boardroom, or on a flight, and felt the sting of being reduced to a stereotype. It was about a society where suspicion is weaponized, where innocence isn't enough, where skin color alone can rewrite a person's story in an instant. Maya knew she couldn't erase what happened to her. But by telling it, by refusing to stay silent, she could force others to look at themselves more honestly. And so, her story became more than a wound. It became a mirror. A mirror held up to every listener, every viewer, every person willing to ask themselves, what role do I play in this? Do I stay silent when prejudice unfolds around me? Do I allow fear to dictate my judgment? Or do I choose to see people as they are, not as my biases tell me they might be? At 30,000 feet, Maya had faced a verdict she never deserved. But here on the ground, the verdict belonged to us. Because racism doesn't just live in headlines or history books. It lives in moments like that flight, in the split-second decisions, the stares, the whispers, the silence of bystanders who look away. And the question that remains, the question only you can answer is this. The next time fear demands a scapegoat, will you be the one who joins the crowd, or the one who stands up for what's right?